I'm very, very grateful that my first novel was Wake and not LFA as was. It was just a much stronger and better novel.
Welcome to Write Off, a podcast about writing rejection in all its varied forms, from self-doubt to books not selling. I'm Francesca Steele, a journalist and writer based in London. I first had the idea for this podcast a year ago, actually. I was listening to a lot of writer podcasts that touched on rejection, but I always found myself wanting more specifics about how people got past those experiences. In part, I think, because rejection is pretty common, and I don't think we talk about it as much as we should. But also probably because I was revising my own novel at the time, and after all that effort, the idea of an author's novel failing to sell and then them finding the blind hope to go on to write again seemed incredible to me. And then I accidentally became very on brand. I found a brilliant agent for my novel, it was shortlisted for a prize, everything seemed to be going so well, and then it went on submission and didn't sell. I was utterly shocked and devastated at the time, but I've since learnt so much from the authors who've kindly shared their stories with me here, not least that rejection is sometimes the beginning and not the end. I hope you find them as inspiring as I did. My first guest is Anna Hope, who is the author of 3 novels, including Expectation, a beautifully written story that was published to great fanfare in 2019, and which tells the tale of 3 friends in their 30s trying to navigate lives which look rather different from what they had expected. Anna knows a fair bit about perseverance. Before she became a best-selling novelist, she was an actor, and she describes that period of her 20s as full of rejection. And then when she turned to writing, her first novel failed to sell. Anna was so warm and honest about how hard that was, and has some really good insight into how that also forced her to really focus on the joy she took from the writing itself. So here's Anna.
I was just reflecting a little bit earlier when I was thinking about this interview about rejection and how difficult it is actually for me to talk about writerly rejection without first talking about acting. So it's really interesting that you've kind of brought that front and center, because I mean, even a successful acting career, and when I say successful, I never felt like I had a successful acting career. I would work for maybe about 3 months a year in a good year, but even a really successful acting career has so much rejection in it. And I experienced a huge amount of it. I mean, I came out of RADA, I was 26. I had a pretty sort of starry agent, and, you know, people tell you all sorts of things and you sort of believe them and you sort of don't. And then you're launched out into this business and people are incredibly keen to meet you. I mean, it could, in so many ways, you're the kind of the fortunate 1%, you know, leaving a place like RADA. But the reality very quickly, you know, becomes something very different. And I think I got my first job as an actor a year to the day that I left drama school. So I was really struggling. I was on the dole in Brighton. I didn't really ever get a following wind. I mean, I would get jobs, and I would have, you know, the odd day here and there in a film, or the odd day here and there in a telly or a play, you know, which would be great because you'd have 3 months employment. But, you know, it just never really worked out. And people would say to me, why aren't you doing something? Why aren't you writing a one-woman show? You know, you could do something like that. You could create your own work. And I had this strange sort of resistance, I think, to writing something for myself. I just saw myself as an actor, which was kind of such a sort of strange, whether it was to do with my personality or the training that they give you at RADA, where you kind of, you're not really, or certainly that's, 20 years ago, we weren't creating our own work, or anyway. And that went on, you know, for like a good sort of 3 or 4 years, 4 or 5 years. And I think I turned 30, maybe I was 31, and I just thought, I can't go on. I cannot go on like this. I'd moved back to London, and I was working in a call centre in Dalston with a load of other actors, which was a fine place to work, actually. But I think I reached a really, really low point in my life. And I thought, something's got to change. But it was actually two friends who sat me down at this really low point and said, you know, you love writing, why don't you go and do a writing course? And I did a little writing course at City Lit, and then I went and did a master's at Birkbeck, and that was the beginning of it, really. So my writing was actually born out of my acting rejection.
And so did you love writing pretty much straight away?
Yeah, I did. So starting Birkbeck, I mean, Birkbeck's a really interesting place, I think a great place, because it has people, because it teaches in the evenings, you know, it has people from all walks of life, you know, people that are fitting their education in around their lives. And so it attracts a really, really diverse student body. And I loved that immediately. And we were told to think of ourselves as writers immediately. I remember, by the professor, and, you know, we all got together, and I just thought, I'm not a writer. We're not writers, you know, we're so far from being writers, but somehow they sort of engendered that.
Yes, I did the Faber Academy course, and they said something similar to us at the beginning of that. And I remember feeling amazed at it.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary thing to hear. Yeah. And what's interesting, I suppose, when you kind of go back and unpack that, is you think, well, what part of that meant that I thought that I was going to be a published writer, right? Because you're
Yes.
a writer whether or not you're a published writer, but we're all there really with the dream of being a published writer. So that's interesting, because then, of course, when you come up against the realities of life after studying, it's kind of different. But yeah.
And so were you writing what went on to be your first novel on that course?
Yeah. So at Birkbeck, I started off thinking that I was going to, I mean, I don't know if your experience was similar, but certainly over the masters at Birkbeck, they taught, first and foremost, they taught through the short story. So we would read and critique short stories, and then we were kind of submitting our own work in workshop alongside that. And I did it part-time as well, which I should say I did it over 2 years, which was really sort of sane for me, because it gave me the time to develop as a writer. But yeah, so I was initially just thinking that I was going to write short stories, and it took me quite a long time to come around to the idea that I would ever be a novelist. I thought I was going to write sort of, you know, these sort of quite spiky, modernist short stories. I mean, I don't think I wasn't thinking about really getting published at that stage, but yeah. And then we did a course on screenwriting, which was really interesting, because he talked through film and structure, and I hadn't really ever thought about structure before. And when I started to think about structure, and I started to think about novels and structure, I started to kind of get quite excited. And I remember writing a synopsis in class. What was one of the exercises was that we had to write a synopsis for a novel in class, and I sort of did it on the back of an envelope and submitted it. And I thought, actually, I could try and write this novel.
Wow.
A thought experiment at first, you know, and then it became a kind of actual experiment. And then I wrote it, and I just loved it. I mean, I think for so many years, I'd had this kind of sense of frustration, deep creative frustration. And it was the first time since being a kid, I think, that I felt like I could just go, you know, just keep writing and writing and writing. And I did till I'd finished it.
So tell us a little bit about that novel, if you can.
Yeah. Okay. So it was a novel which was about a young woman. I was really interested in feminism and you know, and the suffrage movement, the suffragettes, and I'd also grown up. I was really sort of influenced with where I'd grown up, which was the industrial north and that landscape, and how sort of intertwined with sort of social activism that was, you know, in the early 20th century. And I wanted to write about a young woman from the industrial north who becomes involved in the suffrage movement. But I was also really interested in a sort of very little corner of Victorian Edwardian history, which was where these young women had sort of emancipated themselves working class women had emancipated themselves by becoming involved in spiritualism. So they'd kind of basically led or seances, and they had found their voices in this kind of very kind of strange little, I suppose, occult world. And I was interested in writing at the kind of intersection of feminist history, social history, and then this kind of strange little corner of spiritualism. And so I concocted this story about this young woman who is a mill worker in the north, and she comes down to London after kind of meeting these quite strange spiritualist people. And in London, she meets this young woman called Clem. And Clem's a sort of proto-feminist who's studying at a mechanics institute, and they have these sort of wild adventures. And so it was a sort of a mashup, really, of lots of different genres, which is, I think, part of the reason that it didn't get published. But I was like living this novel, you know, I was so into it.
Yes, I mean, I obviously want to hear more about that submission process in a minute, but I mean, it sounds fascinating, and I can hear from you how you're describing it even now, how passionate you were or are about it. How did you get an agent at that stage? Was it at the end of Birkbeck or?
Yeah, it was. I mean, I'd finished Birkbeck in the summer, and I'd written my dissertation, but I'd also sort of written most of a first draft. And so I think I'd written most of a first draft by the September of the year that I finished. And I remember really clearly standing on the street in Bloomsbury and just kind of feeling I really need somebody to help me now. Really need somebody to help me get over this river. I can see this river in front of me. And on the other side are many things that I would love to have, you know, a published novel, a career as a writer. I mean, I understood that those things were difficult to get, and it's not that I felt confident of getting them, but I just thought I really had this really strong image of a river and a boatwoman, somebody sort of rowing me across this river that I didn't know how to navigate. I mean, I didn't know anything about where to go for an agent, and I would say that wasn't a very strong suit of Birkbeck's. Actually, they didn't have, I think it's probably much better now, but at that point they didn't have very strong links with the industry. Anyway, I didn't have a clue, and so there I was, just kind of in Bloomsbury thinking I really need somebody. And I just started looking through the acknowledgements of books that I had enjoyed, and there was a book called The Outcast by a writer called Sadie Jones, and I just really admired her voice, which was sort of a bit, it was quite dark. I liked her prose, and I looked up who her agent was and saw that it was somebody called Caroline Wood, and I sent, you know, 3 chapters off to her, like printed them out, and I was standing in the post office in Hackney with my little envelope, well, my A4 envelope, and my 3 chapters, sending them off, because I don't think they took, I mean, it wasn't that long ago, 10 years ago, but they didn't take submissions via email. So I sent off my chapters, and then
Wow.
And then heard nothing for a long time. And then and then I got a call asking for the rest of my book, and I think then I could send it as a file. By that time I'd sent it off to an agent called Hannah Westland, who was a friend of a friend, and I think she read the first few pages and said, no, it's not for me.
Really?
And then,
so you'd already had that experience by the time Caroline got back to you?
Yeah, but it was quite sort of, I remember it as not being such a big deal, because I think it just was so not, as it was not the sort of book that Hannah Westland agented. And I think once I kind of understood that, when I looked at her list, I was like, oh yeah, it probably wouldn't have been for her anyway. At that time, I mean, but anyway, yeah, so there, and I think I'd sort of given up, because I hadn't heard anything back from Caroline either. And then I was away, I was out of the country, and I arrived somewhere where I got phone reception, and I had sort of lots of missed calls and messages from Caroline saying, I've finished your book, and I really love it, and that, you know, let's meet when you're back. And I met up with her, and I liked her immediately, and she offered to represent me. And from there we started working on the book together.
Amazing. And how long did you work on it for?
A long time. Yeah, a long time. I mean, we worked, so I guess I would have met her in the January, and then we worked for about 3 or 4 months, I think, together. She's an extraordinary agent for lots of reasons, but I would say, I think, she's just an incredible editor. She's really rigorous, and she just will not let anything out until she feels as though it's the absolute best it can be. She doesn't ever really take a punt. She really drilled down into it with me, which was amazing, which was just what I really wanted and needed. And she sent it out, I think, to a small crew of editors, maybe 6 or 7. And there was a really positive response, but nobody said yes. But there was enough of a really positive response to warrant a kind of resubmission. So I redrafted it. And there was an editor, particularly at Faber then, that I was super excited about, who I just stalked on Twitter, and I was like, oh my God, she's the one. She's going to change my life. You're going to buy my book. And then we resubmitted, and I remember I was doing a play, one of the times I was doing a play, and I was in Twelfth Night in Bury St Edmunds, and I remember, she'd resubmitted it, and we'd heard that the editor at Faber was taking it to acquisitions. She wanted to buy it, and I thought this meant that I was kind of home and dry. I didn't really understand the acquisitions process, and then didn't hear anything for a few days, and then just got a call saying it's not going to work. She couldn't get enough people to be excited about it to buy it,
God.
And so I was just sort of, I was like, on so many levels felt kind of gutted, because I'd had such experience of rejection as an actor, and I thought, here was this thing that was a real refuge, actually, from years of feeling buffeted, and from years of just feeling like I wasn't really doing much with my life creatively, and suddenly I'd found this thing, and there I was taking it to the marketplace again, and the marketplace going,
Yes. Can I just drill down a little bit into that redrafting process? Because I think from my own experience, it's easy to sort of say that almost as if it was quite a quick thing, but actually, if you're redrafting on the basis of feedback that's come back from editors, I guess that's, in a way, that presumably instills a bit of extra hope, where you're like, well, I know what to do to get this sold now. Is that how that felt? Or
I think it did, to an extent. I mean, as far as I remember, the sort of feedback from editors was quite general. It wasn't sort of super, it wasn't like line by line. And certainly the one at Faber, it was kind of more of it'd be really interesting to just kind of pull up those emails, actually, and see what she had said, because they I don't know if you've had this in your experience, you often get, if you're lucky, you get a kind of short paragraph about what they liked and what they'd like to kind of see change. But I think I was really writing as well towards this particular editor because I thought she was my best hope, and I also thought she was a great editor. And she had a really lovely list, and I loved her take on the book.
What did you change in your revisions for the second submission?
It was quite radical, as far as I can remember. I mean, I think we first submitted in sort of April time, and this resubmission wasn't till October. So it was a really radical overhaul of the book. I think there was sexual abuse in it at the beginning, and I really kind of looked at how that was working in the text, and I decided that I wanted that to kind of be much less in the foreground. I focused a lot more on the relationship and the friendship between the two women, which would be interesting to come back to because they lived on actually in my second novel, The Ballroom.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, and I think it was that redrafting and living with those two women for those extra months that meant that I just felt like I couldn't really let them go. And so it became a novel about friendship much more than it was a novel about. I mean, I think before I had been, the themes had led the writing, and it became much more character driven. It was definitely a better book the second time it went out, but I think it was always going to be hobbled by this kind of just strange mashup of genre, really. And I think anytime you have a sort of working class woman coming to London, it's just, you've got to work incredibly hard to move away from kind of cliche and and particularly in that time period. And I'd hope that, I hope it did escape that, but yeah, I think it was always hobbled from the start by the genre thing.
I was just wondering if you, having thought about it at this stage, had any thoughts about why it didn't succeed in terms of getting published that you might not have had at the time?
I think it does, I think what I've already kind of said about the fact that it was trying to do too much. It was trying to do too many things at once. It was trying to be this kind of novel about the beginnings of the suffrage movement. It was trying to be a novel about about what it means to come from a certain place in the north and come to London and that experience of this young woman. It was trying to be a novel about science and Victorian spiritualism, and it was trying to be all sorts of exciting things, but it was trying to be them all at the same time. And I think that when I moved away from it and rested it, I was able to take those characters who were actually the strongest aspect of the book, and I was able to put them in a situation where those themes were there actually probably even more strongly in my second book, but it was always driven by character rather than trying to kind of put the themes first.
That's so interesting, and something I can really relate to, actually. I think it's interesting that you mentioned The Ballroom, because I also think some of those themes that you've described also crop up in Expectation, that they're coming from the north and the settling in London. And then also it sounds like it shared something that I noticed Wake and Expectation share, which is this sort of quite a strong atmospheric sense of yearning that seemed to categorize a lot of those books for me. Is that would you say that's right?
Well, I'd say thank you, because I think that's a really fascinating thing and I haven't heard it. So just to be, it always is kind of an amazing feeling to me to be read, and reflected on. So I don't think there's a right or wrong. I think that's a really wonderful observation and one I'm really grateful to have. Thank you. I think that's true. I wrote them in times of yearning myself, I think. So there was definitely a huge amount of yearning in them. Yeah, that's really interesting.
So the Faber acquisitions didn't go as hoped. And then at what point did the sort of penny drop that this was not going to sell? Was it at that Faber point, or was there a more sort of a slower kind of realization that was it?
Yeah, it was sort of then in my body. I think as I just knew, and then there were still like a couple of editors who were reading, but you could feel this sort of feeling of, I was going to say, scraping the barrel, which is just not the right image at all, but it was just a feeling of like, I think quite quickly after that, I thought, you know what, I just want to stop this process now. It's too painful. Yeah. I do not want to just flog this novel at any gosh, I actually just want to write another book.
Yes,
And
how interesting.
and when I'd had that feeling, it was like a kind of oh shit feeling, because it was this kind of sense of, the simultaneous rising in me of like, right, come on, I'm gonna do it, and also this feeling of like, are you really gonna do it? Are you really gonna put yourself through that again?
How did you work up the courage to start again? Because that was what, 2.5 years of working on that at that point, and then all those years of the acting struggles before that we've talked about. How on earth did you work yourself up to another one?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm quite sort of determined as a person, and I suppose I guess I just thought I was a bit, I suffered a lot from depression in my 20s, and it's interesting because so I'll just speak my way through this quite carefully because I've never actually articulated this before, but I suffered a lot from depression in my 20s, and it was absolutely exacerbated by my acting career. And once I started writing, I didn't suffer from depression anymore. I had found the thing that was a sort of deep holding space for my psyche, actually, and my soul. And so it was all the more sort of dangerous in a way than to take that to the marketplace, I guess, because it had offered me such a profound holding. But I suppose in the end, it was the understanding that regardless of whether or not I would get this second book published, it would do me good to write it. It would do me good on every level to write it. And I was extraordinarily fortunate to have a partner who he had seen the change in me, because he'd been with me for quite a few years, and he'd seen the change that writing had brought to me. And he said, I'll pay the rent while you write another book, and you don't have to do as many shifts at the call center. And so that's what he did. And and also he was incredibly kind. I mean, I remember, I think I had about a month off after the plays where I didn't write, and then he woke me up with a coffee, and I've told this story on an interview before, but he woke me up with a coffee and my favorite Virginia Woolf and said, he just said, get up and write another book, start now. And I did.
And then Wake took you quite a long time too, didn't it? It involved a lot of research, and was it several years?
Yeah, it took about 3 years. So yeah, and that was not an easy process. It's not like I then wrote this other book and my life, turned around. I wrote it, and I wrote draft after draft after draft, and draft after draft my agent read, and time after time she said, it's not working. And it got to the point where she said, it's not working, and I can't tell you why. And that was like,
oh God.
Yeah. And I was like, okay, well, so this really is it.
How did you get over that? How did you figure out what was wrong?
I had resisted giving it to my parents to read. They're both incredible readers. Well, my dad was before he got very ill, but and really interesting critics. But I'd resisted giving it to them. But I was at such a kind of point with it, and I just said, look, can you read this for me, and can you be really honest, because it just feels like I just don't know what to do with it anymore. And I gave it to them both to read, and they both came back and said, it's really strong, but you've got to rewrite a third of the book. There's a storyline that's just not working. And that was just incredible advice. They were quite brutal, and they were right. And I did as they'd suggested, and I did a really rigorous rewrite of a third of the book. And then
wow.
Yeah, and then I sent it to Caroline, and she read it, and she said, yeah, no, it's ready, I'll send it out on Tuesday.
Wow. And was that a third in the sense of one of the three perspectives, or was it?
Yeah, Yeah,
Okay. Which perspective was it, if you don't mind me asking?
It was Hetty, the dancer.
Interesting, because she's the first one we meet, isn't she? I mean,
yeah. So yes, that was, and yeah, and then she, then my life did change actually, because she sent it out on the Tuesday, and by the Thursday there was a sort of preempt on it, and then there was a big auction, and then there was a preempt in the States, and and then I didn't go back to the call center.
That's a fairly underwhelming way of describing how much your life changed. I didn't go back to the call center. I just became a best-selling full-time novelist instead.
Well, I didn't become a best-selling, but I became a full-time novelist, and it was just totally amazing.
Yeah. When you were writing Wake and this whole long process, did talked about taking things to the market, did that knowledge of the market at that stage, and the knowledge that sometimes the market wasn't as favorable back as you might hope, did that tinker with your confidence or self-doubt when you were writing?
Yeah, it did. And I think there was a certain point where I just thought, maybe I'd been sort of second guessing things and thinking about, and I'm still guilty of that now, as I write, just thinking, just having to just switch off those voices. I mean, there's so many different voices that you've got to switch off, aren't there? I mean, there's the ones that tell you it's shit. There's the ones that tell you this, but there's those particular voices that are kind of, say, this is what sells, and it's like you just can't listen to them, because whatever you experience with one book is not going to be what you experience with another book, for all sorts of reasons, because the zeitgeist will have changed, because editors are looking for different things, and you just can't know that, and it would be an appalling thing to kind of keep that anywhere in the front of your mind, so yeah, I mean, which is not to say that it doesn't pop up. It didn't pop up regularly, and certainly because I was writing a novel about the First World War, and or the end of the First World War, and I realized at whatever point into it, I was like, oh God, yeah, it's going to be 2014. So in some ways that could be a good thing. People might want First World War novels, and I thought they probably would, but in other ways I thought it could not, it could backfire if the market was flooded and whatever. So that was kind of there in the mix, but I just plowed on regardless, really, and learned to not pay attention to those voices. Yeah.
And so that kind of I guess when you moved from acting to writing, there was a sort of novel optimism in taking on this kind of new creative endeavor. Did that feel like it was still there when you'd had this experience of rejection? Did you still feel optimistic when you were writing Wake?
No, I don't think I did. No, I think I felt like it was hard to write. Actually, it was very tough subject matter, and I felt like I was immersed in a kind of, I mean, it was almost like an underworld experience. I was reading so much about death, and so much about the war, and so much about what people had been through, and that it was not an optimistic time, really. I think I always felt like this was a book that perhaps was more integrated than my previous book. So on a technical level, I felt as though it probably had more of a chance of selling, but I don't remember it as an optimistic period either in my life or in relation to the creative process or what I thought might come of it. No. But it wasn't an unoptimistic period. It was just a period where I was taking it day by day, and also, everything that I say about it being kind of quite a dark time was mitigated by the fact that I always loved writing, and that's always been the case. I am not a writer that struggles to get to the desk. I'm not a writer that has to force myself, in any way. Whatever I'm writing about, I mean, I love the craft of it. I love the solitude of it. I love it. So yeah.
That's so interesting. I wonder what it is about writing compared with acting that feels pleasurable even amidst rejection or the possibility of rejection?
I think it's agency.
Mm.
And because as an actor, you profoundly lack agency. You know, you're just waiting for, I mean, you know, that you're waiting to get a call from your agent to say you've got a meeting. You're waiting to have the meeting. You prepare for it. You put everything into it. You then wait to hear whether or not you've got it or not. And you know, cumulatively, that's pretty toxic, I would say. Whereas with writing, there's just, you know, there's only the sort of financial constraints, which are, you know, yeah, I feel grateful that I started to do it when I didn't have a family and I was able to live on very little. I appreciate there's still, you know, for so many people, the kind of the financial constraints are massive. But yeah, beyond that, I think if you can carve out a couple of hours a day, then there is nothing, you know, it's just you and whichever means you choose to write. And I think that's a really amazing thing. And it's also an amazing thing, I think, in a society which teaches us to be consumers. You know, I think, you know, to just be able to be, you know, creative in a way that's not mediated is profound. And, you know, whatever comes of it, you know, it's a great thing to do. So it's, yeah.
We talked already a little bit about how you felt that you repurposed some of your characters from that first book. Did that first book have a name, by the way?
I think it was called LFA, but I was always open to changing it. So LFA was the character's name, and that's the name of the main female character in the book.
Okay. And did you, I was going to ask you if you ever missed those characters from that first unpublished book, because in a way it's sort of like a little death in a way, creating people and then having to put them away and say, sorry, you can't have a life, you've got to go in a drawer now. But perhaps you don't miss them that much because they did get repurposed.
Yeah, I mean, I think I couldn't bear that little death. I think it's more than a little death, actually. I think it's hard, you know, if you've been through that experience, to say, yeah, to come to terms with that. But I suppose it's like, is it, you know, do they only live if they live in other people's kind of consciousnesses as well? But yeah, of course we all hope for publication and for these characters to live on. But yeah, so when I was planning the ballroom, and I was thinking of characters that I wanted to put in there, I just thought, well, it's those two women, because their friendship was so alive to me still, and yeah, so I put them in the asylum where the ballroom is set, and lived with them for longer, and that was great.
Did your experience, do you think, have any positive impact on your writing long term?
Yes, I mean, I think I'm very, very grateful that my first novel was Wake and not LFA as was. You know, for so many reasons, it allowed me to become a full-time writer, and it was just a much stronger and better novel to have as a first novel. And I think that that's often the case. And I think that, you know, if there are people here who are listening to this and they're either in the process of writing a first novel, you know, or having a first novel rejected, or coming back from that, I think take heart, because I think so often your first novel is learning about the form and learning about the demands of the form. And I think that, you know, it's apt. There is no shame in having your first novel rejected. In fact, in so many ways, for me, it was an invaluable experience. And so I'm very grateful. But it's always easy to look back, isn't it, when you're in a position of relative comfort and ease, and look back at the weave and think, here it was. Oh, it's meant to be like this, like leading to this point, but it certainly didn't feel like that, for me.
Yeah.
In those times of deep rejection, it really didn't. But I do think that maybe deep down, I always knew that I could write a better book. And I think, every novel you're learning about, the demands that your story wants, every story will need a different form, right? So with every new novel, with every new story, you're finding the form for that, the right form for that story. So it's never going to be the same.
Thank you so much for listening to Write Off. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you do have a chance to leave a review or rating, I'd really appreciate it. You can do that in your podcast app, and it really helps people find the podcast. Plus, it just makes me feel good, to be honest. Guests still to come on the podcast include Andy Weir, Catherine Heine, Julian Fellows, Anne Napolitano, Alex Wheatle, Michelle Roberts, Harry Parker, Phoebe Morgan and Douglas Stewart. You can also find me on Twitter. I'm at Francesca Steele with an E at the end. So do pop along and say hello. Hope to see you there. Bye.